So, the tiny but significant island nation of Taiwan will be going to polls later this month in what is going to kick off a series of democratic elections across many countries around the world. In fact, more than 24 countries, over 2 billion people will get to vote their elected representatives. The election in Taiwan is particularly significant because of the tensions, particularly in the last few years, between Beijing and Taipei. We've seen repeated military provocations by the Chinese PLA Navy and the PLA, and of course, Taiwan's response to that as well. For a world that is already beset by two wars, the one between Russia and Ukraine, and now the one between Israel and Hamas, can it afford a third war, God forbid, if it came down to that? And why should anyone here in India, or in the United States, or in Europe, or in the wider Indo-Pacific pay attention to these elections in this tiny island nation? Joining me now is somebody who has a ringside view to what's been going on in Taiwan, both from a policy perspective and, of course, more importantly, from this democratic exercise point of view, is Joseph Wu. His Excellency is the Foreign Minister of the government of Taiwan. Thank you very much, sir, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18.
It's my pleasure to be speaking with you.
Let me start off by asking you, later this month, on the 13th of January, Taiwan, your country, will be going to elections. It's a critical election. Your party, the DPP, has been ruling for the last 8 years. And I believe the candidate who's currently leading the polls right now, Mr. William Lai, is also a senior member of your party. What does this election, coming as it does at this time and at this stage in the development of your country, what does this election mean for you and for the people of Taiwan? What is at stake in this election?
The most important thing is Taiwan's democratic consolidation. This is the 8th direct presidential election in Taiwan. Taiwan is not a old democracy like India, but Taiwan is a young and vibrant democracy. And in the last 7 democratic elections, we had 3 peaceful turnovers of political power. And it's just one more opportunity to prove to the international community that democracy is a way of life here in Taiwan. But the most important of all is that through this election, the people here in Taiwan will decide the national leader and will also decide the policies that we are going to pursue in the next 4 years.
I do want to ask you, Mr. Wu, about those differences that you just mentioned, the difference in policies, because what we've seen over the last 8 years of the rule of the DPP, your party, it's been pretty stridently pro-independence, pro-protecting the freedoms of the Taiwanese people, and there seems to be a slight qualitative difference, particularly compared to the main opposition party, the KMT, which, if I may say, is a little more milder in its approach, a little more conciliatory, if you will, in its approach, particularly when it comes to the question of reunification. Explain to our viewers, to our international audiences, what is the choice before the Taiwanese people between these two political entities, the DPP and the KMT, and why the people of Taiwan, according to you, should vote for continuity of those policies and not a change of those policies?
There's a little correction I need to make. Our political party has been described by some people around the world that it's a pro-independence political party. But in 2016, when President Tsai was running the election, our pledge was to maintain the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. And in the last 8 years, we've been trying very hard to maintain the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. And this kind of policy has won the admiration from the democracies around the world. And it proves that this is a very successful policy in dealing with China or in dealing with the international community. And the leading candidate of our political party is also vowing to maintain the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. So this is the policy direction that the DPP has been heading. And I believe that in the next 4 years, the government elected by the people here in Taiwan will continue to adhere to this policy of maintaining the status quo. But of course, Taiwan is a democracy. People debate about the future of Taiwan all the time. For instance, some other political parties think that Taiwan should unify with China. But if you look at the public opinion here in Taiwan, those who would advocate unification with China. It's only a tiny minority over here. And therefore, during the election time, those political parties will come out and say that they would like to maintain the status quo, but having a better context with the Chinese side. So this is a slight difference among the main political parties here in Taiwan. But for the DPP, the party that I know very well of, we just want to maintain the status quo. We want to maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. We hope we can generate some discussions or dialogues with the PRC so that the two sides can live peacefully with each other or coexist peacefully with each other. So that is the main policy direction of the DPP candidate. But other than that, the people here debate about all kinds of policy issue areas. The cross-strait policy is just one of them.
So I do want to talk to you about that because, as you said, your party represents a status quo across the Taiwan Straits. I believe that President Tsai Ing-wen had some time back said that the future of Taiwan will be decided by the will of the Taiwanese people. But just recently, in his New Year's Eve address, the Chinese President Xi Jinping said that reunification will happen no matter what the cost. According to him, it's just inevitable. So the implication of what he said was that reunification is going to happen even if it takes military means to do that. So how do you see the contrast between what China and its leader has said publicly as recently as just a few days ago and what you describe as a large, maybe even an overwhelming majority of the people in Taiwan who do not want that reunification? How do you see the contrast between the two?
The first thing I should say is that Taiwan is already a democracy. And therefore, anything that concerns the future of Taiwan should be decided by the majority of the people here in Taiwan. And when we are running for the elections, the national election, this is just another time the people exercise their power to elect a leader who pledged to pursue one course for the country. And the current main political parties and their leaders are vowing to maintain the status quo. And therefore, Taiwan, as a democracy, need to listen to the majority of the people. And when the majority of the people says that we want to maintain the status quo, I believe that that will continue to be the policy of the new government. And in the next 4 years, I believe that the new president will also adhere to this policy direction. And in the future, there's all kinds of speculations, maybe 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road. But the most important thing is the election that we are holding right now. This is just another opportunity for the people here in Taiwan to exercise their power, to elect for a political leader to run for the country in the next 4 years.
So the whole Taiwan question sort of really came to the international spotlight in August of 2022 when the then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, and thereafter we've seen some very aggressive provocations from the Chinese Navy, the Chinese military. The U.S. President Joe Biden has said that this is no longer the time for strategic ambiguity. There's been some scaling back on those words as well. But how confident are you, Mr. Wu, that, God forbid, if it actually came down to that, in the eventuality of a military confrontation between China and Taiwan, that the United States would militarily support your country?
This is a good question, and it's also a big question. There are also several aspects on this question that we need to discuss. The first aspect is, of course, the Chinese intention to use force against Taiwan. Even though the Chinese are ramping up their military threat against Taiwan, and we are trying to deepen our defense capabilities or toughen up our defense capabilities so that China understands that it won't be that easy for them to use force against Taiwan. So this is the first thing, is deterrence. I think the deterrence capability on the Taiwan side has been increasing, and that is something that China needs to take into consideration. And of course, the determination of the Taiwanese people is also very important. And at this time, the Taiwanese people are determined to defend ourselves. And the second aspect is whether any other country has the obligation to protect Taiwan. And I need to say that no, that's not the way we look at it. We look at it as defending Taiwan is our own responsibility. If we are not willing to defend ourselves, we shouldn't expect any other country or any other people to come to our assistance. And at this moment, the most important thing is that we are absolutely ready to defend ourselves, and we are highly determined in doing that. And the third aspect of it is the possible impact of a crisis or a war in between Taiwan and China. As you already know very well, that about 50% of the cargoes of the world goes through the Taiwan Strait. And Taiwan also produces about 90% of the most advanced semiconductor chips. And therefore, if the supply chain is disrupted, the entire world will be disrupted as well. The impact is going to be very serious. It's probably going to be more serious than the war in Ukraine. And therefore, we hear more and more international leaders come out and say that the cross-strait peace and stability is very important. And the peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is indispensable to the global security and prosperity because they understand the impact will be very serious. And if the international community can continue to alert the Chinese that using war is going to come with a heavy price, and I think that will also be a very strong deterrence against the Chinese leaders from thinking about using military force against Taiwan. And I would like to also point out that the Chinese are also following their military philosophy of ancient Chinese called Sunzi. In Sunzi's philosophy, the number one rule is never to use a military force if they are able to crush the enemy without using it. And I think the Chinese are practicing that principle right now. They're trying to scare Taiwan. They hope that they can gain Taiwan or regain Taiwan by not using force. So they are using all kinds of postures, military postures, hybrid warfare, or gray zone activities, economic coercion, things like that. But the Taiwanese people have not been scared by the Chinese in the last several decades. And this time around, Taiwanese people will also not be scared.
So you referred to the Russia-Ukraine war. There is also the war happening in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas. And in both of these instances, both these wars are continuing despite popular opinion being against the two wars. And I'm curious to know from you, particularly after what we saw in both of these wars, Russia-Ukraine and Israel-Hamas, whether the appetite for leaders who want to take riskier moves, who want to take military action to change the status quo, the kind of action that was perhaps unimaginable a few years ago, whether that risk has grown manifold, and therefore, as a consequence, whether you believe that China might be tempted to use this opportunity, with the world being distracted with these two wars in Russia-Ukraine and in Israel-Hamas, is there an appetite for perhaps a third confrontation, a third war, where China would be enticed into trying some kind of military adventurism with Taiwan?
That is something that we are concerned about, and that is also something that our like-minded partners around the world have been concerned about as well. If you look at the war in Ukraine, the Ukrainians are very brave in defending their country, and they also use the asymmetric strategy in dealing with a very large military, and at the same time, the international community also showing support to the Ukrainians so that the Ukrainians don't feel that they are alone in dealing with Russia, and that seemed to be quite successful, even though the Russian military is huge. It's the second largest military in the world, but they have not been able to defeat Ukraine. That is because of those factors. And that is something that we are also learning. We want to learn from their determination. We want to learn from their asymmetric strategy. And we are also learning from them by rallying the international support for Taiwan. And so far, we have been rather successful in all these aspects. And I would like to say that China has also been looking at the war in Ukraine as well. And if the Chinese leaders understand that a military as big as Russia is not able to take Ukraine overnight or within a very short span of time, I think they need to consider their possible war against Taiwan. And therefore, if the international community is committed to the peace and stability over the Taiwan Strait, that will be a very strong deterrence against China. And other than that, I also see that the major countries around the world are not only talking about the importance of peace and stability over the Taiwan Strait, they are also trying to act to substantiate their advocate for peace and stability over the Taiwan Strait. Look at the number of countries conducting freedom of navigation operations through the Taiwan Strait. It's been increasing, and they're becoming more vocal in determining to conduct freedom of navigation operations in this region. Look at the fact that the United States is able to have Japan and Korea together to form a new alliance system. And look at the Philippines to the south of Taiwan. The United States, Canada, Australia, and Japan are also coming together to strengthen the Philippines' defense capabilities. And they're very close to Taiwan. So all these postures and actions will also allow the Chinese to understand that the international community will not sit idle if China does something to upset the peace and stability and the status quo across the Taiwan Strait.
And finally, I want to talk to you about India and Taiwan. And even though there are no formal diplomatic ties between Taipei and Delhi, there is increased cooperation in the last few years. You mentioned a moment ago about semiconductors. The Foxconn CEO was here in India for Semicon 2023. That was a few weeks ago. He met the Prime Minister on the sidelines of that. Can you give us an update, particularly on the mobility pact? There were a lot of expectations that before the elections in Taiwan, a mobility pact will be signed between India and Taiwan, but that was not to be. That hasn't come through yet. So give us a sense of the current state of ties between Taipei and Delhi, and more importantly, what is your hope and what is your expectation for 2024 and beyond?
This is also a very good question. There's some simple fact in between Taiwan and India we need to stress out. If you look at Taiwan, even though India is not a country that formally recognizes Taiwan, but the relations between the two are very warm and very nice. Many people, including myself, would always say that I love India. And I say that all the time. And therefore, that provides a very good foundation for Taiwan and India to pursue policies that will be mutually beneficial. And semiconductor cooperation is just one of those areas. The two sides have been speaking with each other in this regard, but we have also been very frank about the experience of building a semiconductor industry. You know, if you look at Taiwan's experience, it took us more than 4 decades to build what we are right now. And therefore, we shouldn't imagine that it will happen overnight, that there will be a company going to India and set up a semiconductor corporation, and then India will become the largest semiconductor producer in the world. It doesn't happen that way. It has to go through several stages. And the current stage in between Taiwan and India concerning semiconductor industry is that we try to open our semiconductor academies to train the Indian engineers. And we are very glad that there's already a large number of Indian engineers working in Taiwan, about 2,700 of them. And we are trying to open up our academies to accept more Indian engineers. And this is the first step. And the second step is for those engineers trained in Taiwan to be able to work in our semiconductor industry, so they gain their working experience to know about the future of semiconductor industry in India. And the third, of course, is for Taiwan and India to hammer out a free trade agreement. You know, if Taiwan makes investment in semiconductor in India, it's not just one company going there. It'll be a whole supply chain moving in the direction of India. And when all these companies, they want to move to India, they are looking for possible incentives. They need to ship or send materials or machines to India, and therefore they are looking for an FTA in between the two sides. And this is the primary issue that we are looking at right now, and we hope that in the near future there can be a very serious discussion in between Taiwan and India concerning the free trade agreement. After all this discussion, I would like to say that this is something that we call it strategic. India is a very important country, and it's a very important friend of Taiwan. And therefore, the high level leaders here in Taiwan are very determined in working together with India